Hello, everyone. Welcome back to today's story. In this episode, we dive deeper into the emotional storm between James and Diep as their love is pushed to the edge once again. After Hoan, James's father, issues another chilling threat toward Diep, fear begins to dictate every choice James makes. Instead of standing his ground, he chooses to disappear. But love doesn't fade so easily, and fate has its own plans. A chance encounter in a quiet grapefruit orchard brings buried truths back to the surface, forcing both James and Diep to confront the pain, misunderstandings, and sacrifices they've been carrying alone. Stay until the end to see whether love can survive fear. And don't forget to subscribe to help us reach 10,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us. The room feels strangely distant, like everything is happening behind a layer of fog. Diep sits across from James, her fingers clasped tightly together in her lap, knuckles pale from the pressure. Her breathing is steady, but only because she's forcing it to be. Every word she's about to say feels heavy, like it's been sitting in her chest for weeks, waiting for the right, or maybe the worst moment to come out. James watches her closely, sensing something is wrong. Her eyes avoid his, drifting to the window, then the floor, anywhere but his face. The silence stretches too long. Finally, he exhales and speaks, his voice cautious, almost afraid. "What do you mean?" he asks. "You said you needed to talk. What is it?" Diep swallows hard. When she looks up, her eyes are already shimmering. "I think," she starts, then stops. Her lips tremble, but she pushes through. "I think we should stop seeing each other." The words hit James like a sudden blow. He stiffens, disbelief flashing across his face. "What?" His voice sharpens despite himself. "What are you saying? Are you saying we should break up?" She nods slowly, as if even that small movement costs her strength. "I don't want our love to destroy your relationship with your father," she says quietly. "I don't want you to lose your family because of me. I don't want you to live your life feeling like you have no one." James leans forward, hands braced on his knees. "Diep, you're not making any sense. My father and I, this has nothing to do with you." Her lips curve into a sad, almost invisible smile. "It has everything to do with me." She finally meets his gaze, and the pain in her eyes makes his chest tighten. "Because I don't have parents," she continues softly. "I know how precious that bond is. I know how deep a father's love can be. I would never forgive myself if you had to fight him because of me." Her voice cracks at the last sentence. She turns her face slightly, wiping at her cheek before the tears can fall. "So it's better if we stop," she says. "It's better for you." The air between them feels thick, heavy with everything they're not saying. James stands up abruptly, pacing the small room like a trapped animal. "You don't get to decide that for me," he says, frustration creeping into his tone. "You don't get to decide what's best for my life." Diep clenches her hands tighter, nails digging into her palms. "I know," she whispers, "but this is the only thing I can do." What she doesn't say out loud is the fear that's been haunting her every night. The way Juan's voice still echoes in her ears, the cold warning in his eyes when he told her, calmly and clearly, that if she didn't disappear, James would pay the price. That his career, his future, even his safety could be destroyed with a single phone call. Juan hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't needed to. The threat was there, sharp and undeniable. Diep had walked away that day with shaking legs, knowing one thing for certain. If she stayed, James would be hurt, and she couldn't live with that. James stops pacing and faces her again. "Did my father say something to you?" he asks suddenly. Her heart skips. For a split second, she considers telling him everything. But then she imagines James storming into his father's office, demanding answers, making things worse. She imagines Juan retaliating just like he promised. So she shakes her head. "No," she lies. "This is my decision." The lie tastes bitter, but she forces herself to hold it together. James studies her face, searching for something, anything that explains the sudden distance. "You're protecting me," he says slowly. "That's what this is." She looks away again. Silence is her only answer. After a long moment, she stands up. "You should go," she says quietly. "I'll stay here for a bit." James laughs once, a short, hollow sound. "So that's it?" Diep doesn't respond. She can't trust her voice anymore. He steps closer, stopping just inches away. For a second, it feels like he might reach out, pull her into his arms, tell her none of this matters. Instead, he says softly, "Take care of yourself." Then he turns and walks out, the door closing with a sound that feels final. Diep remains standing long after he's gone. When she finally sinks back into her chair, the tears she's been holding back spill freely. She presses a hand to her mouth, stifling a sob, her shoulders shaking in the quiet room. Meanwhile, James doesn't go home. He doesn't go anywhere familiar at all. The fear that Diep tried to hide has taken root in his chest. He knows his father. He knows what Juan is capable of. And even without Diep saying it out loud, James understands the truth. She's being threatened. Instead of confronting it, he runs. He turns off his phone. He doesn't answer messages. He avoids every place Diep might look for him. In his mind, disappearing is the only way to keep her safe. If Juan can't find him, can't use him, then maybe Diep will be left alone. Days blur into one another until James finds himself far from the city, working in a grapefruit orchard under the open sky. The sun is harsh, the work exhausting, but the physical strain is a relief. It keeps his thoughts from spiraling too far. "Be careful with those," he calls out to the workers beside him. "Don't damage the grapefruit." "Yes, got it," someone replies, adjusting their grip on a crate. James moves between the trees, checking the fruit, lifting branches, inspecting each grapefruit with practiced hands. "Have you picked everything on this row?" he asks. "Not yet," another worker answers. "There are still a few over there." Customers wander through the orchard, pointing and asking questions. "How much for this one?" "Grade A is 10,000, James replies calmly. "Grade B is 5,000. The smaller ones are 3,000 each." The simple routine grounds him. No arguments, no threats. Just honest work and the quiet rhythm of the orchard. Sweat runs down his temples, his shirt clinging to his back. But he doesn't mind. Pain is easier to handle than guilt. Unbeknownst to him, Diep is nearby. She steps into the orchard hesitantly, the scent of citrus filling the air. Her eyes scan the rows of trees, taking in the scene, and then she freezes. There, among the workers, is a man who looks painfully familiar. Her heart begins to race. Why does he look so much like James? She murmurs to herself, unable to look away. Sunlight filters through the leaves, illuminating his profile, and in that moment, doubt, hope, and fear collide inside her chest, setting the stage for a truth neither of them is ready to face yet. Diep stands still at the edge of the orchard, her feet rooted to the dry soil, as if moving any closer might shatter the fragile scene in front of her. The man bends slightly to lift a crate, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. That familiar gesture, so unmistakably James, makes her chest ache. She tells herself it's impossible. James wouldn't be here. He vanished without a word, without a goodbye. And yet, the more she watches, the harder it becomes to deny what her eyes are telling her. Her breath catches. "James," she whispers, though her voice is lost in the rustling leaves and distant chatter of customers. She takes a step forward, then another, weaving slowly between the grapefruit trees. The scent of citrus feels overwhelming now, sharp and bittersweet, clinging to the air like a memory she can't escape. Every step closer brings a rush of conflicting emotions: relief that he's alive, anger that he disappeared, fear of what his presence here might mean. James doesn't notice her at first. He's focused on his work, explaining patiently to an older customer how to choose the ripest fruit. His tone is calm, steady, nothing like the restless man who walked away from her days ago. Diep watches him finish the transaction, hand over the bag of grapefruit, and nod politely as the customer leaves. That's when he turns slightly and sees her. The world seems to stop. James freezes mid-step, his expression draining of color. For a heartbeat, neither of them moves. The orchard noise fades into the background, replaced by the pounding of his own heart in his ears. "Diep," he says, barely louder than a breath. She stands there, eyes glossy, emotions threatening to spill over. "So it really is you," she says quietly. I thought I was imagining things." James sets the crate down slowly, as if any sudden movement might scare her away. "You shouldn't be here," he says, the words slipping out before he can stop them. That stings more than she expects. "I was going to say the same thing," she replies, forcing herself to stay calm. "You disappeared, James. No calls, no messages. Do you have any idea what that felt like?" He looks away, jaw tightening. "I know." "No," she says, shaking her head. "You don't." The workers nearby sense the tension and quietly move farther down the row, giving them space without asking questions. Leaves sway gently overhead, sunlight flickering across their faces like fragments of a past life. James exhales slowly. "I didn't want to hurt you," he says. "That's why I left." Diep lets out a bitter laugh. "You thought disappearing wouldn't hurt me?" He finally meets her eyes, and she sees it then. The exhaustion, the weight he's been carrying alone. "I thought it would keep you safe." Her heart sinks. Safe from what? He hesitates, then answers honestly. "From my father." The name hangs between them like a shadow. "So it was him," Diep says softly. "He threatened you too." James's brows knit together. "Too?" She closes her eyes briefly, the memories flooding back. Huan's calm voice, his warning, The way he spoke about James's future, like something he could crush without hesitation. "He came to see me," she admits. "He told me to leave you. He said if I didn't, you'd lose everything." Her voice trembles. "I thought if I pushed you away, he would stop." James's fists clench at his sides. "That's why you said all those things," he murmurs. "About my family, about breaking up." She nods, tears finally slipping free. "I didn't know what else to do." He steps closer, closing the distance between them. "You should have told me." "And what?" She snaps softly. "So you could confront him? Make it worse?" "I couldn't risk that." Silence settles again, heavier this time. James looks around the orchard, the simple life he's been living for the past few days laid bare. "So I ran," he says. "I thought if I disappeared, he'd have no reason to go after you." Diep studies him, her anger slowly giving way to understanding. "You can't keep running forever." "I know," he admits, "but facing him means dragging you back into it." She shakes her head. "James, I'm already in it. We both are." A breeze passes through the trees, scattering a few leaves onto the ground between them. Diep looks down, then back up at him. "Do you want to break up?" she asks quietly. "Really?" The question cuts straight through him. "No," he says immediately. "I never did." Her lips tremble. "Then stop deciding everything on your own." James reaches out, stopping just short of touching her hand. "I'm scared," he admits. "Not for myself. For you." She gently closes the gap, placing her hand over his. "So am I," she says. "But being scared together is better than being alone." For the first time since he left, James feels something loosen in his chest. The guilt doesn't disappear, but it shifts, becoming something he can finally breathe through. They don't embrace. Not yet. The orchard doesn't feel like the place for grand gestures. Instead, they stand there, hands loosely connected, grounding each other in the present. "I can't promise this will be easy," James says. "My father won't just give up." "I don't need easy," Diep replies. "I just need honesty." He nods. "Then I'll stop hiding." They talk quietly for a long time, filling in the gaps, the sleepless nights, the unanswered messages, the fear that kept them apart. Each word feels like stitching a torn seam back together, slowly and carefully. Eventually, James pulls his hand back, glancing at the crates. "I still have work to finish," he says. "But if you want to wait..." "I'll wait," Diep says, without hesitation. She sits on a low wooden bench near the edge of the orchard, watching him return to work. This time, the sight doesn't feel distant or painful. It feels real. As the sun begins to dip lower, casting a warm glow across the trees, James finishes up and walks back to her. "There's a small place nearby," he says. "Nothing fancy, just food and quiet." She smiles faintly. "That sounds perfect." They leave the orchard together, side by side, no longer pretending the distance between them is necessary. Neither of them knows what tomorrow will bring. Juan is still out there, his threats unresolved. The future is uncertain, fragile, and complicated. But for now, they've chosen not to run. And that choice, small as it seems, feels like the beginning of something stronger than fear.